Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Resilience Planning, Finances, Funding, and Practice. I'm Ruby Woodside at Second Nature, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Ned Gardner.
Hi, everybody.
Ned is the Engagement Manager for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Next slide. So today is the second in a series of 3 webinars that Second Nature is co-hosting with the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. So a couple weeks ago, we had an introduction to the Climate Resilience Toolkit, and we talked about how that can be a resource for campuses and their resilience planning. If you're interested in this webinar and you missed it, the recording is posted on Second Nature's website. I also hope that you can join us for our next and final webinar, which is in 2 weeks on September 6th. And during that one, we'll hear from Tufts University and from Portland State University. So the agenda for today, we have 2 speakers on the webinar today. We have James McMahon, and I'm sorry if I said your name wrong, who's the CEO of a company called the Climate Service. And we have Dr. Lily House Peters, who's an assistant professor of sustainability science, and also the Resilience Commitment Coordinator at California State University, Long Beach. So today I'll just give a really brief introduction, and then James is going to talk about the financial risk of climate change and how schools can be thinking about that. And then we'll hear from Lily about how California State University Long Beach has been undertaking climate resilience planning and putting into practice some of the concepts that we've been talking about. And then after that, Ned will facilitate a question and answer session. We should have plenty of time for discussion here, so please submit any questions you have. For folks on the line, you can enter questions at any time during the webinar through the chat box on your screen, and then we'll try to make sure we get to them at the end. So just a very brief recap of what we talked about on the last webinar in this series. For some general context, there are over 100 schools in the US that are working on resilience through either the President's Climate Commitment or the President's Resilience Commitment. So you see the timeline here. Most schools are either in the assessment or the planning phase of implementing this commitment. And the goal of this webinar series is to really help schools begin the planning process and to help them find tools to start to turn some of the findings from the assessments into an actionable plan. So as a reminder to signatories that are on the line, schools are required to update your climate action plans by May 2019. So right now is a really good time to start thinking about it and start to map out the process and think about how it's going to work for your campus. So in the first webinar, we also talked about the 5 steps to resilience from the Climate Resilience Toolkit and how these align with Second Nature's framework for resilience planning. So for more information on the 5 steps, you can visit the Climate Resilience Toolkit online. But I just wanted to remind folks that there is a lot of overlap and these resources complement each other very well. So I definitely encourage schools to check out what's on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit and think about how that can help guide your resilience planning. So finally, on the first webinar, Ned also introduced the Climate Explorer, which schools can use to look at some of the projected climate impacts for their region. I think this is a great tool that can help guide your resilience planning and can help schools generate some, for example, images of data and climate projections that could be included in presentations or in your climate action plans. So, I definitely suggest checking out this tool as well. So if you want more information on the resources for resilience planning, you can visit Second Nature's site, or you can visit toolkit.climate.gov. You can also email Ned or myself. You can email me directly. We also have a Resilience at Second Nature email that a few staff receive. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to us. But now I want to turn it over to our first speaker to really move into the main content of today's webinar. So James is going to discuss the financial risk of climate change. And just as a reminder for folks, you can enter questions at any time. So please do so, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, James.
Awesome. Thank you, Ruby. And thanks to both you and Ned for organizing this really fantastic series. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So what we're looking at here on this opening slide is a picture of my old dorm, actually. I just went back a few years ago for 25th reunion, and they had poured all this money into this historic structure and made it so much more ritzy than I could have ever imagined. I mean, we were just cooking noodles in a hot pot on the floor, and now it looks like a resort. and it's right on a river. And I was recently looking at flood map projections for this area, and I was dismayed to see it, sitting under a few feet of water with an increasingly smaller return period for extreme precipitation and flooding events. And I begin to wonder, what are the impacts of climate change on my, beloved old dorm? So today I'd like to talk with you about the financial impacts of climate change and how to measure them and how to manage them. So what we'll be talking about may be a bit of a shift for some sustainability professionals that are used to thinking about climate as greenhouse gas emissions. So what we'll talk about is not only your school's impact on the climate, but also the climate's impact on your school, which is what you've been talking about with resilience. And to contextualize it a bit, I'd like to start with a story. So a few weeks ago, a customer called me up with her hair on fire. I mean, she's a sustainability professional with a large real estate investment firm, and she had just gotten wind that they were in due diligence to buy the property that you're looking at now on this screen. So you can see why her hair was on fire as a resilience professional. So they've all read the headlines about climate change, and their question to me was simple. What's the financial impact of climate change on our organization? It's a simple question, but it's very complex to get to the answer. They'd like to consider it as a risk like any other in their due diligence process, but to get there, you have to look at all kinds of data and do all kinds of calculations. So in a moment, I'll tell you about the process we used to answer that question that I hope will be useful for you. So the next week, I was giving a talk in Idaho, and another one of our customers came up to me with her hair on fire. And next slide, please. So this is not a picture of her hair on fire. Actually, this is a picture of a fire in California on a ridge, and we were in Idaho, but we were breathing the smoke of a fire on the next ridge over as we were talking. And her question to me was simple. What's the financial impact of climate on our organization? So noticing a theme, she's not alone, and neither are you or anybody else asking this question. Last year, according to NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, there was $306 billion of damages from billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in the US alone. Of that, Aon estimates that approximately 38% of that was insured. So 62% was on somebody's balance sheet or on somebody's income statement that year. And those are eye-popping numbers, but not as eye-popping as the next number I'm going to share with you. So next slide, please. And that number is $82 trillion. That is the value of the assets under management of the investment firms that are asking for better disclosure of climate risk. So they know that these are firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street. They are holding these assets, and they know that they are exposed to climate risk, but they don't know how much or where or when. They're asking for better disclosure. And that may be important to you because already Moody's, the credit rating agency, is incorporating climate risk into municipal bond ratings. So, it's only a matter of time before the cost of capital is affected by your ability to measure and manage climate risk. So let's look at an approach we can use to do that. Next slide, please. So in order to answer the question, what's the financial impact of climate on organization, we have to consider what I call the 3 M's. And prize to anyone who can guess why I call it the 3 M's. So climate risk, in order to get anyone's attention, has to be material, measurable, and manageable. Material meaning financially meaningful, whether the definition that the SEC gives is that a reasonable investor would find it interesting to know in their investment decision-making process. And for you all, that means, yes, there is mission impact, and also, yes, there is financial impact of climate change. And being able to state it in terms that are material requires that, number two, you have to be able to measure it. And I'll share a bunch of techniques with you about how to do that in a moment. And then finally, it doesn't matter if you can measure it if you can't do anything about it. So it's important that we come with solutions. And next slide. So first we'll look at material. This happens to be a picture of the floods in Houston. And you can see that, of course, this is creating a huge amount of financial material damage. Next slide. Because the risk is so great, the G20 and their Financial Stability Board, this is an international industry group, has spun up a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So if they're going to ask the industries to, or whoever, to report on what are your climate risks, they need to tell people how to do that, how to think about the financial impact. So when this figure came out in a report about a year ago, I got so excited that I had it tattooed on my lower back. Actually, you can look at how they broke it down into risks and opportunities and how that flows into strategic planning and risk management. Those are the two main ways you use this data. On the risks side, they broke it further into physical risks. Those are the kinds of things that I was just showing you, the acute risks of flooding and the chronic risks of things like sea level rise and temperature creep, and the transition risks. Those are things like directors and officers are increasingly being sued because they're not disclosing what could be material financial risks. Policy risks like the threat of carbon taxes, technology risks like new, highly efficient technologies that are just leaving money on the table if you don't implement them, reputational risks, etc. So all of these gray boxes need to be looked at in order to understand your financial impact. So again, this is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The abbreviation is the TCFD. It's a horrendous acronym, but I think you might find it quite useful if you can find this chart if you Google it. So next slide, please. We'll look at how to measure each one of those gray boxes, because again, it doesn't really matter until you can measure it. And next slide. So here is an example of this is quite well aligned with what I believe you learned in the last webinar about how to assess and measure your risk. And so it's a simple three-step process, looking at first the hazard, understanding what could cause harm. Second, the vulnerability. What kind of harm could it cause and how much? And then third, the value at risk. So how would it cause harm in your finances? So let's look just for a moment at the left-hand column, and we can see some examples of what I'm talking about with these hazards. So in the physical realm, coastal flooding, river flooding, drought, wildfires, heat waves, we're all pretty familiar with this stuff. In the non-physical arena, this is what they call a transition risk, or transition to a low carbon economy. And these are things like carbon pricing, litigation, and reputational risk. In the middle column, we can look at vulnerability, and note that a single hazard can have multiple vulnerability pathways. So if you just think about temperature, for example, or heat wave, that could cause direct damage to actual physical equipment. For example, your HVAC could be overloaded and damaged. As a matter of fact, we had a client who came to us with that exact problem. Of course, it can also drive up cooling costs. And then there's employee health and productivity. If you have workers that are working outside, it's unsafe to work outside during some types of heat waves. So you can see how one hazard can drive multiple vulnerabilities. The key to this vulnerability is that it has to, or it's most useful if it actually quantifies the financial impact that that hazard will have on you. So let's tick down this list a little bit more, and you can see more about what I'm talking about. So with supply chain, anytime you're buying or selling something, and you guys do all the time as well, you can worry about not only the interruption of the supply chain. You physically can't buy computers because a typhoon wiped out the the memory chip manufacturing plants, or the costs of the equipment have gone up, and you either have to buy it and incur costs that you weren't planning, or you just postpone it because it's too expensive, not in the budget. And then there are market-based vulnerabilities like brand value, market value, new products. And you can see over on the right all the different ways that it can hit your finances, including balance sheet, income statement, and cost of capital. So next slide, we'll dive down a little bit further. This is going to get nerdy. Hang on to your hats. So for example, here's an example of a temperature distribution, a summertime temperature. And you can see the green curve is the historical distribution of temperatures, and the blue curve is what's happening in the current era, and then the orange and red curves move to the right. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the importance of considering this as a probability distribution. And why is that? It's because we're usually quite well adapted to what usually happens, the means, but we're usually not well adapted to the extremes. And take a look at about 47 degrees Celsius. That goes from almost never happening to happening sometimes in the current period to happening most of the time in the red in the future. So next slide. Once we know the distribution of the hazards, we can then multiply by the vulnerability, and it's most useful to think of this as a family of curves that relate the damage that the hazard could cause to the hazard itself. And so the black curve in this case represents very highly sensitive to whatever we're looking at. This happens to be drought. And the orange curve represents not very sensitive. So in this way, you can play with scenarios and say, well, what if I was to put in some resilience and harden my ability to adapt? Next slide. And then you can multiply those two things together, the hazard times the vulnerability. You get a value at risk, and then you can look at how it changes over time. It's important to notice kinks in the curve, like in 2020, the past does no longer predict the future. Next slide. So once you are able to do that, then you can go through all those gray boxes that I showed you and look at things like water efficiency. I'm looking at the left-hand chart now. Water efficiency, temperature extremes, storm damage, and compare them and see what is most important. Find the top risk factors. You can also find the top locations if you have multiple locations or multiple buildings with different things going on in them. And then the timing. Is this a now problem? Is this a 30 years from now problem, etc. So next slide. And then dive down more deeply into looking at the hazard, vulnerability, and risk at a given location for a given hazard. It really takes getting down to this level to calculate your financial risk. So on the next slide, I just want to point out that it's important that we consider this to be these are manageable risks because, next slide, the climate risks are financial opportunity. And it's an opportunity not only to improve your mission, but to improve your mission's finances. So on my last slide, which is next, I'll just give you a flavor for the kinds of opportunities that these financial impacts can turn into. Top right is operations planning. That's once you know that cooling costs is a risk for you, you can then size your HVAC appropriately and not get caught with unplanned capital expenditures. That's an example of how you could use this in operations planning. In investment management, you can tilt. So we're actually working with a large university endowment, and they're interested in all these equities that we hold. Where are the risks? And what can we do to hedge and tilt out of those? Risk management is something that almost every organization does, and just looking at what are the top risks and then what can we do about them, both financial solutions and engineering solutions. And finally, strategy and governance. What are the, how does this impact the strategy? What do the Board of Governors need to know about it? How does this affect the very highest levels of operation and longest term strategies? So on the next slide, I'll just say thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And please do feel free, this is a deep field, feel free to reach out and ask anything you like. I would love to do whatever I can for you.
Great, so I think now we're going to turn it over to Lily at California State University, Long Beach.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Ruby for facilitating this webinar, and thank you, James, for a really interesting presentation. I'm going to speak here about our kind of resilience planning story at California State University, Long Beach, and I'm going to be speaking from my position as a resilience commitment coordinator, but also as a faculty member on campus, which gives me a little bit of a unique kind of position between two worlds. And just a brief overview, I'm going to talk about our road to kind of signing the resilience commitment, how we've then been really putting the resilience commitment into action over the last 2 years on campus, really focusing on how we've been building partnerships, coalition building, engaging our students in applied research and integrating resilience into curriculum, and some of our funding strategies, especially thinking about our campus's long-term strategic planning and the city of Long Beach's kind of planning around climate as well. So a couple, just to give you the context of our campus and quick facts. So we're a large urban campus. City of Long Beach is located in Los Angeles County. We have about 500,000 people in the city of Long Beach. Our campus's population is about 38,000 students with an additional 6,000 staff and faculty members. So we're almost a campus of 45,000 people, so like a small city. We have a large campus space, about 323 acres. So that just kind of gives you a sense of who we are. Next slide. And our campus is guided by a number of commitments. The ones I really want to focus on are kind of our second nature climate commitments, but we are also do sustainability planning around the larger California State University system's sustainability policy. We first signed the carbon commitment, and that helped us to set our climate neutrality goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2030, but it also really started us down a path of thinking more about climate change from a mitigation standpoint. When we signed the resilience commitment just 2 years ago in 2016, that really kind of took us down a new kind of pathway thinking about resilience, which I'm going to talk more about. And so, as you probably know, especially if you're signatory, the resilience commitment really set us up with the goals of establishing a joint kind of campus community coalition around climate resilience, conducting a climate resilience assessment, and then the part that we're moving into now is to create our resilience plan, implement it, and integrate climate resilience and adaptation into our climate action plan. Next slide. So this is kind of the roadmap for our climate activities. And on our campus, it was really spearheaded by a leadership call from faculty as well as some of our administrators back in 2010. That got us on the road to first sign the carbon commitment in 2011, and in 2014 we published our first climate action plan. And that was really particularly focused around mitigation, around our carbon footprint in particular. And this is kind of important because we've had to really shift how we think about climate risk and how we're going to become more resilient in thinking about the resilience commitment and our kind of funding of the resilience commitment, our resilience activities, and how we draw on partnerships and coalition building in doing this. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about the coalition and the Charrette in upcoming slides. I will just quickly say, coming off of James's talk, that for us, the way we've been envisioning resilience has been more around impact to our mission rather than necessarily financial impact. But now I have so many more ideas really around thinking about the financial risk, but we've been more thinking about mission impact primarily. So in first thinking about our climate risks, this was actually kind of spearheaded or catalyzed some of our partnership building. And that was really around thinking strategically about what we would focus on as primary climate risks to our campus. And so we worked actually really closely with our City of Long Beach agency partners, as well as the Aquarium of the Pacific, which is a partnership that I'm going to highlight a little bit more in this presentation. So working with kind of our early partners who were the city and the Aquarium, we decided that we would have kind of be able to facilitate more joint action by really focusing on 4 risks that the city has taken on as the primary risks that they're planning around. We also have a Resilient Long Beach campaign that the Aquarium of the Pacific has been spearheading. And so we tried to kind of really align our campus planning with also what was happening in our city. Our city is also going through a climate action and adaptation planning process right now. And so that's given us also some more leverage by aligning to these 4 climate risks, which are thinking about drought, extreme heat, deteriorating air quality, and sea level rise and flooding. Next slide. So really kind of important piece of this model that Cal State Long Beach has followed has been to dedicate a resilience commitment coordinator position from the beginning of becoming a signatory to the climate commitment. So I've been serving for the last 2 years as our resilient commitment coordinator. It's a faculty release time model, which means that I get 3 units a semester, which comes out to approximately $12,000 a year, $6,000 a semester. It's much less expensive than hiring another staff member, but it really increases our staff's capacity in the Office of Sustainability in order to really do a lot of the work around resilience, in particular being a liaison between the campus and the community, spearheading outreach and networking, and really conducting our campus resilience assessment activities, as well as doing our compliance reporting to Second Nature. And so also as a faculty member, this has really increased kind of faculty engagement. It turns part of our resilience commitment work to really focusing on curriculum development as well, and how to build climate resilience into our curriculum on campus, and increasing kind of our student engagement and the number of kind of research projects and learning opportunities around climate resilience. So that's been another interesting piece of having kind of a faculty member step into this role and work closely with staff and administration. And the funding for this, I'll just briefly say, came from our president's office when she signed the resilience commitment in 2016. Next slide. So an important piece when we began this putting the resilience commitment into practice was a significant shift in thinking. And this is still an ongoing process, but we had to really envision a broader campus community landscape and partnerships than we had originally really thought about with the carbon commitment itself. With the carbon commitment, we had really focused inward on our campus, on increasing the efficiency of our campus operations and infrastructure to reduce our carbon footprint. With the resilience commitment, it really challenged us to expand our thinking beyond our campus boundaries and to really start to think about who is our community, where do our students hail from. We are primarily a commuter campus. And so what we did is we began kind of some data analysis early on, and this is just showing you where our students are coming from by zip code. And so we had to begin to think about who we would partner with, how our students could be affected in many ways through different types of climate risks based on the fact that we are primarily a commuter campus. So we're still working on some of this boundary work of who the campus is, what our bounds are, where do we interact with the community, but it's been a really interesting way to shift our thinking around climate change planning. Next slide. And then our first year, we really focused on coalition building. And this has been a time-intensive and ongoing process to build and then maintain and sustain relationships with our city agencies, our community partners. And a lot of my work as the Resilience Commitment Coordinator has focused on developing and then implementing community outreach plans. And we really took kind of a multi-scalar approach about first thinking about on our campus, what silos did we need to break down in order to think about resilience planning in a more integrated manner. Then we looked at our kind of city, local community level here in Long Beach, and then also took a regional approach, being that our students hail actually from across our region, and then even looked to kind of the state level for partnerships as well. And we found Second Nature's guidelines very helpful, that you can kind of see there, identifying key partners, facilitating meaningful interactions, and coordinating and planning and aligning our common goals. This has also been an important way that we can think about leveraging other sources of funding beyond kind of some internal sources here on campus that we're working to leverage in long-term funding of resilience work, but really also thinking about funding opportunities that our partners open us up to, working with Port of Long Beach, as well as things like the Aquarium of the Pacific, another large nonprofit organization that really opens up other types of grants and funding opportunities for our resilience work. So that's been another piece of our kind of coalition building and drawing on these partnerships. Next slide. So one key partnership I just want to highlight is the Aquarium of the Pacific, which is located here in Long Beach. They're a nonprofit organization, and they've been really key for us because they're a local, highly trusted organization, but they also come with very relevant scientific expertise and a lot of resources. And so we've been able to co-organize and co-host a number of events with the Aquarium of the Pacific, both on our campus, at the Aquarium, and then actually out in the community as well. We've also been able to, through working with the Aquarium, we were able to have, there was a late night event they hosted with local city council members around sustainability and climate resilience, which really drew a very different public to a free night at the Aquarium than we would necessarily engage with here on campus. And we really also drew on this partnership when we hosted our Resilience Charrette, which was a stakeholder workshop and the basis for our resilience assessment, by having scientists from the Aquarium actually present to the stakeholders who were present about the primary threats facing our local region with climate change. And so that partnership has been really helpful to us, and I hope helpful to them as well, and has allowed us really some other engagement opportunities we otherwise might not have, and to reach a larger audience, as well as grant and funding opportunities that we've kind of been able to piggyback on to some extent, and other ones that we're working forward together in the future. Next slide. So briefly, we held a Resilience Charrette, which was an immersive stakeholder workshop with 50 invited participants who attended, coming from across our campus. We had students, faculty, staff, administrators, city agency staff and leaders, and then stakeholders from community groups, local residents, and property owners from around the campus area. And this was also co-hosted as a partnership between our Office of Sustainability, Center for Community Engagement, and the Aquarium of the Pacific. And we followed a great workshop template developed by the Nature Conservancy, Dr. Adam Welchel, to do this very facilitated process where we had small breakout groups, and the stakeholders went through a very facilitated process to identify the primary climate risks, and then thinking about what these hazards are potentially going to do to our campus and our community, and then prioritize our next steps in moving forward for joint action. And so next slide. Cool. So what this allowed us to do through this day was to really kind of assess our resilience, both positive aspects of resilience that we see in the campus and community and challenges that we have moving forward, to align priorities. And we actually found some very common key takeaways. And I won't go into that too much, but it was a really interesting experience to have a very diverse group of stakeholders go into separate kind of facilitated working groups and actually come back with very closely aligned goals from those. So we found that to be a really interesting process of really building on those partnerships and networks that we had developed in our first year of the resilience commitment. Next slide. And so I want to speak about some of the integration with academics and curriculum that we've been doing as well. And this is another place where I've dedicated a lot of my energy as the resilience commitment coordinator, as well as being on the faculty side. We have green thread workshops for our faculty led by our Office of Sustainability, which trains faculty in how to integrate climate resilience and other sustainability principles into their syllabus, and especially syllabi and courses that maybe have not yet focused on sustainability. And so we've been having those workshops and having faculty move through those so that we can increase the amount of kind of climate resilience curriculum on campus. We've also had a lot of good success with service learning courses and project-based courses specifically around climate resilience. And I have a couple slides showing some of our applied research projects we've been working on. We have taken advantage of Campus as a Living Lab, which is funds that we've competed for, and that's allowed us to fund some engaged student research projects specifically around local climate threats on our campus, really looking at experimental ways to think about some resilience planning. And we have an annual sustainability project showcase that also really highlights the resilience commitment and climate resilience in the classroom. Next slide. So our students, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, have been working on applied research projects specifically aligned with our local climate risks. So, for example, we have a campus flooding potential issue, and we did not have a kind of accurate campus flood map. And so we actually had students in our Masters of GIS, Geographic Information Systems program, do a master's level project creating a campus flood map. And using this flood map, we are now able to do some simulations of different types of precipitation and storm events and where we could expect flooding on our campus, and we can start to think forward infrastructure and other kinds of changes that can be made in order to help us become more resilient to flooding. Around issues of extreme heat and air pollution, we have an Operation Healthy Air project that undergraduate students have actually been working on as part of service learning. And we've been taking temperature measurements at different areas around our campus, really thinking about how the campus design, especially vegetation, trees, and our buildings are influencing areas where we have particular high pollution emissions and extreme heat. We have an environmental sensor network that we're working on setting up right now that will also do longer term monitoring of extreme heat and air pollution. And as I was saying earlier, some Campus as a Living Lab projects as well. Next slide. And when we have as well some student-led groups and events that we draw on to also also bring the community in and that focus around climate resilience. So we had a large State of the Environment conference with about 300 attendees. It was free and open to the public, and we were able to do that by leveraging some really diverse kind of internal as well as drawing on some of our partnerships for external funding. And by having this be a student group led initiative, we were actually able also to draw on academic and student funding opportunities as well. And this was a really great way to continue to sustain some of our partnerships with the community, bring in local experts from the community to give keynotes and sit on panels, and a way to bring new kind of members from the public in. So these are some more kinds of events that we're hoping to continue to leverage to really increase the profile of climate resilience on campus. Next slide. And so kind of finish up, I want to talk about how we're thinking about integrating resilience with strategic planning and really thinking about the funding piece as we move forward. So our campus is currently, and I'm sure there are a number of other campuses, kind of thinking about long-term planning. And we have a Beach 2030 plan that is currently under development. And we've been working as we go through our choosing resilience indicators during the last year and doing our resilience assessment, working with administrators who are also part of this Beach 2030 strategic planning to choose indicators that align well with the long-term plan and to find indicators where we get a lot of buy-in and we think that there can be kind of financial investment as we move forward. So really thinking about from the beginning, how can we get climate resilience priorities into this long-term planning process so that also it's in our long-term funding processes here on campus. And you can see actually that in the text kind of copied below, which comes from the website of the Beach 2030 plan, changing climate patterns is one of the things that's highlighted. So really trying to break down the silos so that we see climate risk reflected in planning across our campus and in areas where in the past we maybe wouldn't have seen climate risk and changing climate be a talking point in long-term planning. And also thinking about our city's long-term planning that's going on right now around climate change and seeing where we can align our priorities there as well to open up funding opportunities. And next slide, at the end here. So just briefly, some lessons learned from our experience so far is really trying to be strategic, look for ways to align both on campus and in the community, and ways to really increase public education opportunities by creating partnerships, and especially partnerships with areas where there's a lot of public outreach opportunity, aligning priorities, as I was saying, and that's also helpful for thinking about diverse funding opportunities, as many campuses really face issues when it comes to funding these kinds of things on the long term. Flexibility and willingness to collaborate, co-hosting workshops and trainings, thinking about ways to come up with research collaborations across campuses, city, and then leveraging these diverse funds. Next slide, and I think I'll just finish up here. Okay, and then just a brief summary has been really the position of Resilience Commitment Coordinator, I think has been a key piece of success on our campus, especially with implementation. And just recognizing that building partnerships, while extremely rewarding, is very time consuming, and making sure there's the capacity there to do that well. And for time's sake, I'll just, next slide, my contact information is here, and I'm happy to be in contact with anybody who would like to discuss more about kind of our experience or resilience planning on the campus level.
Thanks, Lily. That was fantastic, and it's an incredibly rich plan and set of activities that you're involved with. Wanted to tie together these two presentations here at the outset. There are quite a few questions coming into the chat box, and we'll get to those very quickly. But to sort of think about, you mentioned that you focus primarily on the impact to your mission of climate change. And could you just speak a little bit to the challenge of bringing in your own university risk management and emergency management folks into the conversation about climate change, because the first presentation was very much about assets that are exposed. And so what's it going to take to get your risk managers to pay attention to climate change?
That's a great question. And I know different campuses, the organizational structure differs. There's an emerging conversation that I've been seeing really taking off around how to really integrate the climate resilience planning and the emergency management and risk management, and how do you bring together those people? On some campuses, you actually have overlap of people working across these areas, or even emergency management might be housed under the same umbrella as Office of Sustainability or Risk Management. On my campus, emergency management is housed kind of in a different organizational area than our sustainability planning. They're under the police, they're housed with the police. And so for us, there's been thinking about the priorities. That's been a challenge of getting really the climate risk priorities into our emergency management planning. And depending on different schools, you know, we have a lot of focus on active shooter and other types of kind of very current kind of threat in emergency management. But James's presentation really showed, and we've already seen on our campus, that the risk to our infrastructure is really going to be potentially massive from climate change. And so these are conversations really breaking down those silos that we're looking at strengthening in this coming year as we go to write our resilience plan to make sure that it really integrates well with the emergency management plan and vice versa, and thinking about how do we bring those financial risk managers into this conversation to look even beyond business continuity, which has been one of the focuses of our resilience indicators, but to actually think about how do we assess. We've done the hazard assessment, so we've done some of these, and the vulnerability assessment, kind of the first two pieces that James spoke about, but then how do we jump to the next kind of value at risk piece? And so I actually think this is a really important area that we're gonna work hard to make gains in necessarily.
Thanks. So I wanted to give James an opportunity to follow up on that, and I just want to ask you, James, in your experience, does speaking in the 3 M's open doors with people who maybe are in other departments and otherwise may not be paying attention to climate? And in your answer, if you could just briefly tell people a little bit about your background, the last 2 jobs you had before being CEO of your company, I think that might help set the stage of how, you know, the authoritativeness of the information you've got to offer.
Sure. So I would say that the 3 M's aren't as important at lighting up people's faces as the 4th M, which I didn't talk about, which is money. You know, it's a little, it's a little unfortunate, perhaps, for those of us obsessed with mission and are driving towards, you know, good things and resilience, that when you put dollar signs in front of things, people's ears perk up. And particularly people in the administration and people who are creating and setting budgets. So I was delighted to hear in your fantastic presentation, Lily, about the integrating into this strategic, on your slide on integrating into strategic planning, that you're looking at how do we get this in the budget? Because once it's in the budget, things start happening. And how do you get it in the budget? Well, you don't put, you have to have a dollar figure on it. And you have to have, ideally, if you can say, we spend $1 and we get $3 back, that is an extremely compelling argument. So to Ned's questions about, you know, where does all this data come from? A couple of jobs ago, I was working at NOAA's National Climatic Data Center, serving the director as his advisor. And so I got to see firsthand how the petabytes of data that they've got were sometimes used. And we felt like, oh my gosh, this data is a gold mine. People are making decisions all the time that ought to be based on this data that aren't. And why? Because it needs to be translated into usable information that people can use, and often that is financial. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Sounds good. And just want to clarify, some of the graphics you were showing are output from the product that you developed. So
Yes.
That translation is something that you're actively working on. And I just wanted to make sure people got to that point. A lot of people are asking in the chat window about the availability of vulnerability assessment and hazard exposure information either online or through analyses. How do you determine what infrastructure is exposed and most at risk? So I think both of you showed different ways of looking at that. So why don't we start with Lily? If you can talk about at a campus level, how you show exposure, vulnerability, and risk of your asset.
Sure. So this has been actually one of the very helpful things about some of our partnerships is accessibility to data through some of our city partners, and then also through the Aquarium of the Pacific, which they've been leading some of the climate change, especially around sea level rise, coastal flooding, but they've also been really engaged with extreme heat threats and worsening air pollution as well. So some of the data, especially around coastal flooding and sea level rise and some storm modeling, we've actually drawn on work that they've done and some of the local models that they've been working on. For some of the data around looking at local scale projections for changes in heat and especially extreme heat, we've been drawing on some data that's come out of other local universities like UCLA, where they have scientists, faculty members who have actually downscaled to a very kind of local regional scale some of the larger long-term climate scenarios. And so that's been helpful for us as well. And then we've also taken advantage of the state of California has created some platforms to look at different social and environmental issues, like spatial kinds of platforms where they have a lot of the California data indicators, and you can kind of hone in on local areas. So that's some of the work we've been doing that's looked a little bit more kind of community and regional scale. And then for our campus, really looking at our flooding risk and some of our areas of especially vulnerable to extreme heat and pollution loads. That's been some of the work we've been actually doing with students and really trying to get the students involved and engaged in some of this monitoring work. For us as primarily a large kind of teaching institution, we've really been trying to draw on actually working with our students to do some of that work at the campus scale.
And James, do you want to take a stab at that, the availability of that?
I'd love to, Ned, because that's exactly why I quit my day job and decided to form this company, because I could see that, you know, hazard and exposure data is a necessary first step, but the availability of the vulnerability curves is just so limited right now. But, you know, if you think about it, you can get all kinds of wonderful, wonderful data from the Climate Resilience Toolkit and climate.gov and all kinds of other places. But to some extent, there's a step missing after that, which is so what? For example, in that picture of my dorm that I showed, if they got, let's say that there's a little spillage from the river and they get, you know, an inch of water in the basement, well, it'll cost them $100,000 to clean up. They could just budget for that and bake that in, and that's not a big deal. So that's exposure, And it may even be an increasing exposure, but it may be tolerable and it may be budgetable. Whereas if they get sick, if they're actually, underwater and they stay underwater for a while, several days, that's a catastrophe. And so it's really important to make that connection between just simple exposure to a risk and then the so what. Because only once you understand so what can you ask the question, and now what do I need to do about it?
It's music to my ears. Okay. Lily, we have an alumna or alumnus, not sure which, who wants to know about protecting future matriculants, and specifically with respect to aligning your priorities with municipal and state level commitments that exist. You happen to be in a state that's very forward thinking about climate adaptation and mitigation.
Yes, so being in California, actually all of our cities are currently going through a climate action and adaptation planning process. And so we happen to Long Beach happens to be doing this CAP planning process at kind of the same time that we're going through the resilience planning process. So that's been kind of a nice alignment there. But really in working with the city, that's been partly why we kind of chose to really hone in on the 4 risks that the city is primarily thinking about, is so that we want to kind of facilitate joint action whenever possible as we move forward with our resilience planning. And so getting into both our campus's long-term strategic plan, thinking out to 2030, but also really making sure that what the city is planning in terms of their climate action plan is, well aligned to what the campus is doing, but also helps to recognize and protect campus resources has been important to us. And so a lot of this is actually work that just thinking about alone as a campus, especially transportation planning. As a commuter campus, if we were to just think about transportation planning alone without partnering with the city and thinking about how they're planning to do it, it would be almost impossible. So we've really been looking for areas where we need the buy-in from our municipal area or even, our kind of regional partners in order to really think about integrated planning, because transportation is something we know is going to be impacted by climate change in a dense coastal area that we're located in, and that's going to affect our mission and our ability to serve our students if they can't get here, if faculty and staff can't get here, and also emergency planning if we can't get out of campus. So we've seen a lot of benefits from having these joint conversations together, with those planners in the room.
Well, thanks. There are a number of questions about your coalition building and workshop content processes. One person wanted to know why you're building coalitions, rather than presumably what I'm interpreting as working into existing frameworks and ways that people work. What is the incentive of getting other administrators in your university to cooperate and work within your framework? It is the top of the hour, and I think what I should do in order to be sensitive to people's schedules is follow up with you and send out an email. Ruby and I can put together an email and get answers out to people after the fact, since it's the top of the hour. So I want to thank both of you, Lily and James, for excellent presentations. And Ruby and I look forward to seeing folks online 2 weeks from now. And Ruby, would you like to close the session?
Yeah, just thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks again to Lily and James. This has been really fascinating. We'll follow up with email for any questions that we didn't get answered. The video will be posted online, and we hope to see folks in 2 weeks at our next webinar.
Everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruby. Thanks, Ned.